Hey friends, tonight we're diving into something we all experience, sleep, but through the eyes of people from centuries ago. And trust me, the way medieval folks slept, it's a lot stranger than you'd expect. Before you settle in, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe if you enjoy this kind of content. No pressure, only if it really speaks to you. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is. I love seeing how this little community spans across the globe. So lower the lights, maybe grab a blanket or let that white noise hum in the background, and let's drift together into the eerie, fascinating world of medieval nights. Before electricity hummed in our walls and screens pulsed beside our beds, the night held a very different kind of meaning. It wasn't just a gap between one day and the next. For medieval people, night was a threshold. Not merely a pause in routine, but an encounter with the unknown. The darkness outside was heavier, thicker, almost alive. Shadows moved differently. Silence stretched longer. The absence of artificial light didn't just dim the world, it transformed it. When the sun disappeared beyond the horizon, so too did certainty. In its place came ritual, mystery, and a rhythm of rest utterly unfamiliar to modern minds. In today's world, we chase sleep, as if it's a commodity, a performance to be optimized with blackout curtains, digital detoxes, and the latest memory foam mattress. We speak of sleep hygiene and track our REM cycles with wrist-bound sensors. But for much of human history, sleep wasn't a problem to be solved. It was something the body simply did. And it did so in two distinct halves. What may sound like a sleep disorder to modern ears was once a perfectly ordinary night. People in medieval Europe commonly experienced what we now call segmented sleep. As dusk fell and candles burned down, families and travelers alike would drift into their first sleep, a deep and uninterrupted slumber that lasted several hours. But then something curious happened. Sometime in the middle of the night, perhaps around midnight, perhaps later, people would wake up, not with alarm or panic, but with intention. This wakeful period, known in some writings as the watch, was accepted as a natural part of life. No one called it insomnia, no one feared it. In fact, many cherished it. During this quiet interlude, the world softened. Fires were tended, prayers whispered, livestock checked. Some used the time for reading scripture or reflecting on their day. Others simply sat in silence, letting their minds drift. This hour or two of wakefulness wasn't seen as an interruption to rest. It was a space for thought, for stillness, for the quiet work of being human. Afterwards, they would ease back into their second sleep, a gentler descent into dreams that carried them until sunrise. The rhythm matched the natural arc of darkness in a world ungoverned by clocks. Without the push of late-night entertainment or blue-light distractions, people followed the cues of the world around them. The body, left to its own devices, seems to favor this pattern even today. In the absence of artificial light, some sleep researchers have found that modern subjects will naturally revert to a two-phase cycle, not unlike their ancestors centuries ago. To us, waking up in the middle of the night might signal anxiety or imbalance. But in the past, it was simply a different chapter of the same night. Not a failure of sleep, but a second breath, a quiet pause, a return to consciousness before surrendering once more. And perhaps that's where the strangeness lies, not in how they slept, but in how we've forgotten what sleep once was, a conversation with the dark, not a battle against it. The pause between first and second sleep was more than just a window of wakefulness. It was a pocket of life, folded quietly into the fabric of night. Unlike the jarring modern concept of waking at 2 a.m. and frantically reaching for a phone, this interruption was smooth, expected, and, in many cases, deeply purposeful. People didn't lie in bed counting sheep or worrying about tomorrow. They got up. They moved. They did things.
For many, the first instinct was spiritual. The darkness was seen as a sacred space, and the hours between sleeps were believed to hold a unique intimacy with the divine. It was during these moments that men and women knelt beside their beds or in shadowy corners, whispering psalms, reciting memorized scripture, or offering personal confessions into the stillness. This wasn't the dramatic, performative worship of a crowded chapel. It was quiet, private, and intensely reflective. A kind of spiritual maintenance, small, repetitive gestures to soothe the soul while the rest of the world slumbered. Elsewhere, the hours were practical. Fires had to be fed, embers coaxed back to life. In colder seasons, that fire might be the only thing standing between a family and freezing air that crept through stone walls and thatched roofs. Farmers would slip out to check on animals, to ensure that the goat hadn't slipped its tether or that the chickens were still safely roosting. It was a gentle survey of the world outside, a reassurance that the small systems of life under one's care were still intact. But these moments weren't only about devotion or duty. For many, the middle of the night became a time of closeness. In the quiet, when the body had already shed the tension of the day and the mind was not yet fully returned to sleep, partners turned to one another. Medieval texts, from physicians' notes to marriage manuals, describe these hours as ideal for intimacy, when the body was rested and the mind quiet. It wasn't framed romantically so much as functionally, like a part of life that simply belonged there, nestled in the dark between waking and dreaming. What began as a natural pause slowly evolved into a kind of ritual. People expected the waking. They planned around it. Some even structured their evening activities, knowing they would return to them later in the night. Letters were written. Mending was done by candlelight. Quiet conversations passed between neighbors living close together or under the same roof. The house, though dim, stirred with soft life, a whisper of wakefulness shared by thousands across villages, towns, and cities. Medieval physicians, influenced by both observation and early theories of the human body, considered this segmented sleep a normal rhythm. The idea that the body needed 8 uninterrupted hours would have seemed strange. Instead, they believed that sleep worked best in waves, with the waking interval serving as a natural release of excess energy or internal imbalance. Religion supported this rhythm too. Monastic schedules were built around it, with prayers dividing the night like bookmarks. Even as cities grew and nights became louder, this quiet intermission persisted. It was neither insomnia nor restlessness. It was simply part of being human. The darkness wasn't empty. It held its own kind of motion, its own language. And for those who lived within its rhythm, it offered something that today we rarely find in the heart of the night: calm, intention, and a moment to breathe in the silence. To speak of comfort in the medieval world is to adjust our expectations entirely. A bed wasn't a sanctuary draped in softness. It was more often a compromise between exhaustion and whatever materials could be gathered before nightfall. For the vast majority of people, sleep took place on what could barely be called a mattress. Bundles of straw or hay, gathered and stuffed into sacks if fabric was available, or simply spread across cold floors. This humble construction was called a pallet, and it bore little resemblance to the plush rectangles that line modern bedrooms. It crackled, it shifted, and it often itched. For peasants, there was no such thing as personal bedding. The family shared the same cramped corner of the home: parents, children, sometimes a grandparent, and often a scattering of animals. In one-room houses, the bed was a communal heap where warmth was shared out of necessity, not affection. The scent of livestock, the rustle of feathers, the occasional nudge of a goat's hoof in the ribs, these were ordinary parts of the nightly routine. Clothes served double duty, worn during the day and slept in at night, rarely washed, often infested with company too small to see and too persistent to ignore. Insects thrive in the straw. Lice were regular guests. Fleas darted between seams. Field mice, drawn to warmth and crumbs, might burrow beneath sleeping bodies. But people adapted. An itch was ignored. A bite endured. Movement during the night was done carefully so as not to disturb whatever might be sharing the bed. It was a balancing act between discomfort and the necessity of rest. Still, some families with modest means managed slight improvements. Elevating the straw on a wooden frame reduced contact with damp ground and crawling creatures. It didn't transform the experience, but it made it marginally more bearable. Those with a few coins to spare might add coarse blankets or worn linen, but for most, sleep meant curling into warmth beside siblings, cousins, or strangers, and waiting for dreams to carry them above it all. At the opposite end of the spectrum, nobility knew a different kind of sleep, though even their standards by today's measure would raise eyebrows. Wealthier households boasted real beds. Large wooden frames carved with ornate details, mattresses filled with feathers instead of straw, and draped canopies that trapped warmth and kept out drafts. These beds were often heirlooms, passed down like prized possessions. To inherit a feather bed was to gain not just comfort, but status. Embroidered sheets, dyed fabrics, and pillows, things most peasants never touched, formed a cocoon of privilege.
Yet even in these finer chambers, the world was not sealed off. Fleas did not discriminate. Lice traveled easily, and warmth was still a challenge, especially in the stone rooms of castles, where the chill clung to every surface. Fires burned low through the night, and bodies still huddled together, not out of poverty, but from the raw physics of heat loss. Lapdogs slept under covers, less as pets, and more as tiny heaters. Heavy curtains were drawn not for privacy, but to trap in whatever warmth could be captured from the hearth. True comfort, then, was relative. For the poor, it meant not sleeping in the mud. For the rich, it meant waking up with fewer bites. And for everyone, it meant survival, finding enough warmth, enough stillness, enough quiet to let the body rest in a world that never quite made room for ease. In the hush of a medieval night, long before thermostats or insulation, sleep wasn't just a matter of lying down. It was an act of preparation. Clothes weren't removed so much as rearranged, and the garments chosen for sleep spoke volumes about a person's status, resources, and sense of modesty. Chief among these bedtime staples was an item that today conjures images of holiday cartoons and Victorian ghosts: the nightcap. The medieval nightcap was no whimsical accessory. It was a practical response to cold air that drifted relentlessly through stone walls and thatched roofs, with body heat escaping fastest through the scalp. These fabric caps were a simple defense against freezing nights. Their forms varied, some close-fitting and round, others long and trailing like a wizard's soft cone. Made from wool, linen, or patched scraps of whatever warmth could be spared, they were tied under the chin or left to dangle over one eye. In wealthier homes, they might be embroidered or dyed, subtle signals of a family's standing, even while asleep. But the cap was more than thermal gear. In many regions, especially across northern Europe, head coverings at night carried social and religious weight. Married women were expected to keep their heads covered at all times, including while they slept. The nightcap became an extension of modesty, not just a garment, but a statement of virtue. In towns and cities, a man answering the door in his nightcap was silently declaring himself unavailable for discussion. The hat itself became a polite refusal, a fabric signpost saying, "Now is not the time."
Paired with the cap came the nightshirt, a garment whose simplicity bordered on the ascetic. Loose, long, and often shapeless, these tunic-like robes hung down to the knees, or even the ankles. There was no trim, no tailoring, and certainly no softness, just rough fabric, usually linen or homespun wool. Function ruled every seam. The goal wasn't comfort, and certainly not elegance. It was warmth, ease of movement, and the ability to slip quickly between wakefulness and the demands of a house that might catch fire, flood, or welcome unexpected guests at any hour. Unlike today's curated sleepwear, which flirts with fashion and leisure, medieval sleep clothes were worn without sentiment. Most people simply kept on whatever garments they'd worn during the day, adjusting layers as needed. Washing clothes was difficult and infrequent, and sleepwear, if it existed at all, often doubled as emergency attire for nighttime chores or sudden danger. For those in religious orders, clothing held an even stricter role. Monks and nuns slept in full habit, not just out of convenience, but out of discipline. Sleep was not a retreat into softness, but a continuation of service. To remove one's robe was to remove a layer of purpose. The garment became a kind of spiritual armor, even under the covers, modest, scratchy, and unrelenting. Sleepwear in all its forms mirrored the era's values: modesty over comfort, simplicity over style, function over desire. It wasn't about looking good or even feeling good. It was about preserving warmth, displaying virtue, and staying ready for prayer, for duty, for whatever might come in the dark. Imagine arriving at an inn after a long journey through mud-slicked roads and unpredictable weather, exhausted, cold, and in desperate need of rest. You walk inside, ask for a bed, and instead of a key or a room to yourself, you're led to a wooden frame already occupied by two strangers, perhaps snoring, perhaps staring at you with equal parts suspicion and resignation. In medieval Europe, this wasn't a mistake, it was standard practice. Pillow sharing with strangers was an expected part of travel. Inns weren't quiet sanctuaries with room service and fresh linens. They were more like human stables, large communal halls with rows of beds, or even just piles of straw laid out shoulder to shoulder. Privacy didn't exist. If there was space beside someone, it was yours to take, and no one found it particularly awkward. The social expectation was not that you'd sleep alone, but that you'd make do with whatever sleeping arrangement was available, no matter how crowded or curious it might be.
Beds often held 2, 3, sometimes even 4 unrelated travelers. You might find yourself wedged between a merchant who talked in his sleep and a tanner who smelled like the day's labor. The goal wasn't comfort, it was shelter. A roof over your head was luxury enough, and warmth, even if it came from the body heat of a stranger, was something to be grateful for. If the person next to you rolled over and muttered nonsense, you didn't complain. You simply shifted and tried to disappear into sleep before they started talking again. In larger towns and cities, inns could resemble dormitories, vast echoing spaces filled with travelers sleeping elbow to elbow. Some establishments attempted order by assigning beds according to profession, blacksmiths with blacksmiths, clergy with clergy, as if familiarity might soften the awkwardness. But more often, it was first come, first collapsed. And while the idea of sharing a bed with a stranger might raise eyebrows today, in a world where outdoor sleep meant wolves, robbers, or freezing rain, it was the safer bet. Of course, safety was relative. Theft was a constant worry. With bodies pressed together and belongings tucked nearby, it was easy for fingers to wander. Travelers adapted. They slept with purses tied tightly to belts or knotted beneath clothing. Some used their bundles as pillows, turning bags into makeshift alarm systems. If someone tugged at your pack, the motion would jolt you awake. Others kept a hand on their valuables all night, or placed them inside their shirts like chest-worn vaults. The wealthier sort avoided all this. Nobles traveled with entourages and often demanded their own quarters, threatening innkeepers with lost status or worse if made to share. But for the average person, sleeping beside someone you'd never met was as normal as sharing a meal. The modern idea of personal space hadn't been invented yet. Bodies brushed in church, in markets, on roads, and in bed. The night didn't belong to you alone. It belonged to whoever else was tired enough to need it. As darkness thickened outside and flames retreated to embers, sleep wasn't entered casually. In the medieval mind, night was not simply a pause in daylight. It was a threshold, one that the soul might or might not return from.
These were not soft bedtime blessings or abstract meditations. They were urgent, precise, sometimes even fearful. Many prayers before sleep read more like last rites than evening rituals. The most common of them, familiar even today in fragments, held lines like, "If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take." Sweet on the surface, but beneath it lay an uncomfortable truth that one might not wake, and that the soul, unguarded, could be vulnerable. In a time when illness struck without warning, when fire was a real threat in wooden homes, and when spiritual warfare was considered an everyday risk, bedtime became a moment of reckoning. People confessed sins quietly under their breath. They recited psalms from memory. Some whispered the names of saints, hoping for invisible protection. These prayers weren't performed for peace. They were insurance policies for eternity. Parents taught children to pray not just out of tradition, but as a form of early spiritual training. Tiny voices repeated solemn words with wide eyes, their hands folded awkwardly beneath woolen covers. They were told angels were watching, not as comforting companions, but as celestial overseers keeping track. If a child squirmed or forgot a line, a parent might remind them that God notices everything, even in the dark. Certain prayers were tailored to specific fears, one for illness, one for guilt, one for demonic temptation, especially if one had heard odd sounds in the rafters. Those more devout might call upon their personal patron saint. Monks and nuns, bound by structured religious routines, ended their day with compline, the final prayer of the canonical hours. After that, they entered silence, not as a suggestion, but as a command. And in many homes, even among lay people, that same silence took hold. After prayer, voices ceased. Conversations ended mid-thought. There was a quiet understanding that once the soul had been placed in divine hands, no more words were necessary or allowed. It was an act of reverence, but also of fear. Speaking after offering yourself to God for the night might break the fragile spiritual shield you'd just constructed. The silence that followed wasn't just about stillness, it was about humility. A recognition that the night didn't belong to you, that something larger and perhaps less forgiving held sway in the hours when firelight faded and dreams began. To sleep without prayer for many was to risk being caught unready, and readiness was everything when the boundary between dreams and judgment felt so thin. In the medieval world, dreams were not shrugged off as random flickers of the subconscious or the side effect of a heavy meal. They were treated as serious messages, sometimes divine, sometimes dangerous, but never meaningless. To dream was to enter a realm where your soul, unanchored by the body, might wander into territories sacred or profane. What happened there could reveal hidden truths, expose buried sins, or, in the worst cases, invite spiritual peril. A dream might be a whisper from a saint, offering guidance or comfort. It could be a warning from heaven, veiled in symbols, fire as punishment, water as purification, a bright road as the path of virtue. But just as often, it was feared to be a snare. The devil, it was said, did not rest when you slept. He could use dreams to tempt, confuse, or accuse. A harmless vision might turn out to be a trap. A warm encounter with a stranger might be interpreted as a test of your soul's weakness. Theologians, monks, and self-styled visionaries built entire frameworks around dream interpretation. Manuals circulated, pairing dream images with meanings. A lion might symbolize courage, or perhaps pride. A goat-headed man juggling fish. That one probably warranted immediate confession and a few days of fasting. There was always an edge of caution. If you dreamt of sin, some believed, it reflected the state of your soul, even if the act had only happened in sleep. That dream where you stole bread? It might mean you were greedy or hungry. But either way, it was safest to pray about it, just in case. Religious figures often recorded their dreams in detail. Monks, especially, wrote journals of nighttime visions and submitted them to spiritual superiors for evaluation. A dream could mark someone as chosen or blessed. It could also get them accused of pride or delusion. The boundary between revelation and blasphemy was paper-thin. Some were even celebrated for their dreams, like Hildegard of Bingen, whose visions were treated as divine communications and preserved in illuminated manuscripts. But not everyone was so fortunate. Claiming to dream of angels might inspire awe or suspicion. Outside the cloister, dreams filtered into literature with equal weight. Medieval romances often used dream sequences to deliver prophecy or moral lessons. Knights would fall asleep and find themselves in enchanted forests where allegorical creatures spoke in riddles. A woman made of fire might warn of betrayal. A staircase into the clouds might offer a path to redemption. These episodes were not just poetic tools. They reflected the real belief that dreams were stages upon which truth played out in disguise. And yet, beneath the holy symbolism and lofty interpretations, there was unease. Dreams couldn't be controlled. They exposed vulnerabilities, desires one wouldn't dare admit, fears too deep for daylight. If someone dreamt of something unwholesome, it was rarely ignored. Better to confess, fast, or sleep further from the hearth. Sometimes it was blamed on smoke fumes, but more often on a restless spirit. In the stillness of the night, when the world dimmed and the soul wandered freely, people in the Middle Ages knew that dreams were not innocent. They were dispatches from unseen forces, guides, warnings, or traps, and the only safe way to meet them was with prayer on your lips and suspicion in your heart. Long before radiators hissed or thermostats clicked, warmth was a living, breathing resource, and often it had hooves. In medieval homes, where walls leaked wind and roofs sighed under the weight of rain and rot, heating wasn't a matter of convenience, it was survival. And so, as strange as it may sound now, many people chose the most dependable heaters available: animals. To the modern ear, the idea of sleeping beside a chicken might raise eyebrows, and the presence of a pig in the bedroom might sound like a punchline. But for peasants across Europe, it was entirely ordinary. Livestock were not simply a livelihood, they were insulation. Cows gave milk during the day and heat during the night. Chickens laid eggs and doubled as a kind of feathery foot warmer. Dogs curled into the crooks of legs or sprawled across sleeping children, steady and warm. Even goats, not known for their manners, often found their way into the same straw piles where entire families rested. It wasn't affection that drove this arrangement, though people did grow attached. It was physics. A single cow could raise the ambient temperature of a one-room home. A dog pressed against your side meant the difference between shivering through the night and actually sleeping. Body heat was currency, and animals had plenty of it to give. The layout of the average home reflected this relationship. Most peasant dwellings were just one room: kitchen, dining area, bedroom, and stable combined into a single shared space. There was no hallway to separate humans from animals, and certainly no barn with heating lamps. The animals were there for the night because that's where the heat was. And if it meant a child waking up nose to beak with a goose or a farmer rolling over onto a piglet, so be it. Comfort came second. Warmth came first. Symbolically, the scene feels absurd. Humans huddled with hens. Nobles judging from afar while scratching at their own fleas. But in practice, it was simply smart. Adaptation shaped by necessity. And as unromantic as it sounds, this living arrangement offered something else: familiarity. In a world where death came often and unpredictably, where crops failed and diseases spread fast, the presence of a trusted animal in your bed or at your feet was, in its own strange way, a reassurance. Even among the wealthier classes, animals weren't always banished. Lapdogs curled up beside noble women, sometimes not just for companionship, but as status symbols and, whether acknowledged or not, for warmth. Castles were drafty too, after all. Some noble estates went so far as to give animals their own designated sleeping quarters, a luxury that said as much about the owner's pride as their pet's comfort. But animals brought more than heat. They brought fleas. They brought noise. They brought unpredictable behavior into the most vulnerable hours of the day. Chickens clucked. Dogs barked in their sleep. Pigs rooted through straw at inconvenient times. Yet medieval people made room for all of it. A snorting cow in the corner didn't interrupt sleep. It was part of it. If you ask a modern person to describe the ideal night, they might mention silence, solitude, soft lighting. In the Middle Ages, the perfect night was warm. However, it had to be achieved. Through blankets, bodies, or a drowsy sheep at the foot of the bed, that was the goal. Warmth didn't just mean comfort. It meant life. Sleep inside a medieval monastery was not about comfort. It was about surrender, not to rest, but to order. In these cloistered halls, where every breath followed a rhythm of devotion, even the act of lying down was choreographed by discipline. The dormitories, often vast and echoing, resembled more a barracks than a place of peace. Dozens of monks slept side by side in stiff, orderly rows, their wooden beds arranged with the same precision as their prayers. No curtains, no pillows, no privacy. Just silence and the sound of breathing. Shallow, restrained, obedient. The beds themselves were austere, sometimes bare wooden planks, sometimes topped with a thin layer of straw. A more generous abbot might allow a rough mattress, but such kindness was the exception, not the rule. Blankets were coarse, robes remained on. Monks slept fully clothed, not for convenience, but as a rejection of indulgence. Removing one's habit was seen as unnecessary, even inappropriate. After all, a monk was meant to be ready at any hour to rise for prayer, to serve, to suffer. Why bother with comfort when comfort distracts from salvation? And so the uniform stayed on, robe, belt, sometimes even sandals, and the monk lay down not to relax, but to rest just enough to continue. Those in stricter orders went further, choosing to sleep sitting upright or leaning against a wall, as if reclining too deeply might invite spiritual laxity. Softness was viewed with suspicion. Sleep was not a gift, it was a necessity granted in measured doses, a momentary pause before the next obligation. Within the dormitory, the rules were absolute. No talking, no whispering, no sighs of exhaustion. Silence wasn't encouraged, it was enforced. Under the rule of Saint Benedict and other monastic codes, noise was considered a disruption not just to others, but to the divine order. A single groan could be seen as a lapse in humility. And though snoring couldn't be punished, not directly, persistent offenders often found themselves assigned extra chores or removed from communal spaces until the issue quieted down. Lighting was minimal. Perhaps a single candle left a gutter in the dark. You didn't need to see. You weren't meant to read or reflect. You were meant to be still. A body at rest, a soul at attention. The absence of light mirrored the absence of comfort, an intentional environment built to erase distraction, indulgence, and anything resembling pleasure. This wasn't cruelty, it was theology. Denying the flesh was a path to spiritual strength. Hard beds prepared the soul for hardship. Cold air taught discipline. And the lack of softness stripped away vanity, pride, and laziness. The dormitory became not just a place of sleep, but a nightly classroom of humility. Monks believed that their Spartan beds trained them for eternity, that every night endured without luxury was a rehearsal for the ultimate departure from this world. To modernize, their rest might seem severe, even inhumane. But for those within the stone walls of the cloister, sleep was not a retreat from the world, it was a continuation of surrender, a horizontal act of devotion, carried out in silence, beneath rough blankets and under the gaze of heaven.
At a time when most of the world still slumbered, deep in the hours when darkness pressed heaviest against stone walls, the monastery stirred. Not with chatter or clamor, but with the distant toll of a bell, deliberate, solemn, inescapable. It was the signal for matins, the first and most haunting of the canonical hours, and it summoned monks from their narrow beds into the icy corridors of discipline. The clock read something like 2 a.m., though time in the cloister was measured less by hour and more by duty. The dormitory creaked as robes rustled and sandaled feet shuffled across cold floors. No one spoke. Words were not needed. Each monk moved silently, their bodies wrapped in layers of coarse fabric, their minds still fogged with interrupted dreams. Sleep had not ended, it had paused, to make room for God. The chapel, lit by flickering candlelight, felt more like a cave than a place of praise. Shadows gathered in the arches, and breath hung visibly in the air. The monks lined up in their assigned places, standing or kneeling as chants began to echo through the chamber. Matins wasn't a quick prayer whispered beneath the covers. It was a full liturgical service, often lasting an hour, sometimes more, depending on the order and the season. Psalms were recited, scriptures read aloud, and voices joined in slow, melodic unison. The sound was both ethereal and earthly, the weight of discipline pressing against the quiet beauty of devotion. But beneath the chants and candlelight, discomfort ruled. The cold bit at fingers and toes. Stomachs groaned for meager evening meals. The body, unready for alertness, wavered in place, swaying slightly, struggling to remain upright. Falling asleep mid-service wasn't uncommon, and those caught dozing might be assigned extra prayers, cleaning duties, or simply the public embarrassment of being nudged awake by a fellow monk with more stamina. Yet no one questioned why they were there. The ritual wasn't about comfort or understanding. It was about sacrifice. Monks believed that by offering the first hours of the night, the quietest and loneliest ones, they were giving God what was most pure. Before the sun rose, before worldly concerns intruded, they brought their voices, their shivers, their sleepy bodies to the altar. This break in the night wasn't a burden. It was a gift, though one wrapped in hardship. To be summoned from sleep and answer that call wasn't failure. It was fulfillment. The absence of rest was not a flaw in the monastic life. It was the point. Sleep, like food and speech, was regulated, measured, used. A tool for humbling the flesh, sharpening the will and maintaining alignment with a divine rhythm that cared little for personal comfort.
After matins, some monks returned to their narrow beds for a second sleep. Others, depending on the order, went straight into study or labor, threshing wheat, copying manuscripts, or tending the monastery grounds. Sleep was secondary to purpose, and in that early morning hour, when silence reigned and bodies trembled beneath thick robes, every moment spent awake was a whispered offering, not because it was easy, but because it wasn't. To sleep alone in the medieval world was not just unusual, it was unsettling. Solitude, especially at night, carried with it more than the chill of cold stone and creaking timber. It carried spiritual risk. The belief wasn't just that darkness hid dangers, but that being alone within it exposed you to them. Shadows didn't simply fall over the room, they gathered where the soul was most vulnerable, in isolation. For many, sleep was not the gentle descent into rest we imagine today. It was a crossing, a temporary release of the soul from the body. And if you were alone during that passage, with no witnesses, no companions, no physical buffer between you and the invisible, anything could happen. You might fall victim to temptation, visitations, or worse, possession. The devil, people believed, worked hardest at night, and the solitary sleeper offered no protection against his whispers. Group sleep, then, was more than convenience. It was defense. Families packed into shared beds, not just for warmth, but for spiritual insulation. Children nestled between parents. Cousins curled beside one another. Even house guests, servants, or neighbors might be included if they happened to be present when the hour grew late. A bed filled with bodies was a kind of sanctuary, a barrier of breath and skin against whatever waited in the silence. In folklore, solitary sleepers were often the ones who vanished. A young man found dead in the morning with no sign of struggle. A woman seen walking into her home, never to emerge. Stories didn't point to illness or crime, they whispered of fairies, of spirits, of pacts made or broken in the night. If someone behaved oddly the next day, if they were silent, fevered, or confused, people might ask, did they sleep alone? Because that, in itself, was an explanation. Even among married couples, it was rare to find an empty bed. Children were welcome, often expected, to share the space. Servants might sleep at the foot or in a corner. Privacy was a foreign concept, and solitude was suspect. In religious communities, this belief was reinforced. Monks and nuns slept in shared dormitories, watched by their peers. But if one was assigned to sleep alone, usually as punishment, it carried weight. Being sent to a solitary cell for the night wasn't just disciplinary, it was spiritually dangerous. Without others nearby, the soul stood exposed. And if strange things happened? If someone woke screaming? If a sleeper claimed to have seen a figure at the end of the bed or felt a weight pressing on their chest? The explanations varied, but the warning remained. Never sleep alone if you don't have to. You might wake up touched, changed, or not wake at all. In a world where invisible forces shaped everyday life, where prayers guarded every threshold and whispers filled the gaps in understanding, group sleep wasn't just a comfort, it was a shield. A chorus of breath, a web of limbs, a defense not only against the cold, but against the dark. Not everyone in the medieval world lay down to sleep. In some homes, and more often in monasteries or among the devout, there were those who chose or were instructed to sleep sitting upright. To the modern eye, it seems uncomfortable at best, a punishment at worst, but for many this posture was a conscious act, tangled in superstition, spiritual discipline, and deeply flawed understandings of the body. One of the simplest reasons was fear. Not fear of bad dreams or creaking beams, but of being mistaken for the deceased.
In a culture where death could arrive suddenly and unannounced, especially during the night, lying fully prone was associated not with rest, but with the grave. That posture, flat on the back, hands folded, eyes closed, mirrored too closely the final pose of the departed. To lie like that too peacefully might tempt confusion, or worse, attention. Some believed that the angel of death could mistake a resting body for one ready to be taken. Sleeping upright became a kind of signal to the spiritual realm. Not yet. I'm not done here. Let me pass through this night untouched. Medical ideas of the time offered their own strange logic. The theory of humors, the belief that the body was governed by shifting balances of blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, led to the conviction that lying flat encouraged congestion, particularly in the head and lungs. Upright sleeping, some physicians argued, allowed better flow of internal vapors, preventing suffocation or mental imbalance. In an age when a sneeze could be seen as a bad omen, this made perfect sense.
For the deeply religious, sitting up while sleeping became a kind of living penance. If comfort dulled the soul, then denying it sharpened one's devotion. Monks in stricter orders leaned against cold stone or wooden benches, dozing in measured intervals. To recline too far might invite indulgence. To dream too deeply might invite temptation. Better to rest lightly, stay present, and avoid any softness that could lead the mind astray. In noble circles, elevated sleep could also be a subtle sign of health consciousness. Some wealthy individuals had beds rigged with bolsters or angled boards to support their backs and keep them upright through the night. These contraptions, part furniture, part philosophy, gave the illusion of control over digestion, breath, and destiny. Sleep, once feared and mysterious, was shaped into something deliberate and restrained. But behind all these justifications, medical, spiritual, or social, was one shared truth. Comfort was secondary. Whether one sat up out of fear or faith, the goal was the same: to wake, to continue, to avoid slipping too far into the posture of the lifeless, and by doing so, remain firmly among the living, even if it meant a crick in the neck and a night without dreams. Long before sleep hygiene meant white noise machines and essential oils, the average medieval sleeper fought a very different kind of enemy, one that crept, bit, and burrowed in the shadows. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs weren't rare inconveniences. They were nightly companions. No matter how poor or privileged, few people escaped their touch, and for many, the experience of rest was less about dreaming and more about scratching. Straw mattresses, the most common form of bedding for peasants, were perfect breeding grounds. Stuffed into sacks or piled loosely on floors, they trapped warmth and moisture, offering the ideal conditions for tiny intruders. Lice traveled easily from head to head, woven into shared linens and unwashed clothing. Fleas jumped from animal to human and back again. Bedbugs nestled into the seams of fabric or the cracks of wooden bed frames, waiting patiently for the heat of a resting body. Sleep became a contest between exhaustion and irritation. Lie still and be bitten. Move too much and risk awakening the entire room.
Attempts to fight back were creative, if not always effective. Some families burned pungent herbs like wormwood or tansy, hoping the smell would drive pests away. Others scattered ash beneath sleeping areas, rubbed garlic into cloth, or hung dried onions over the bed. It's unclear whether the bugs minded, but anyone hoping for nighttime romance would likely think twice. Nightcaps, which helped preserve body heat, doubled as a kind of armor, shielding the scalp from curious invaders. Some people even slept fully clothed for this very reason. Less about modesty, more about survival. Wealth didn't always bring relief. Nobles wrapped themselves in finer fabrics, but bugs didn't care about embroidery. Even the feather beds passed down through generations could harbor colonies of tiny creatures. In fact, some wealthy households employed nitpickers, servants whose entire job was to comb through their employer's hair and garments, removing lice with patience and precision. It was a task as intimate as it was thankless, and a reminder that no one, regardless of status, was immune. Yet beyond the physical discomfort, these pasts took on symbolic weight. In sermons and poetry, fleas and lice became metaphors for sin, small, persistent, and humiliating. It wasn't just that they made you itch, they reminded you of your fallibility, of your closeness to the earth, to filth, to temptation. In some moralizing texts, parasites were divine messengers, little punishments for pride or sloth. Entire poems were written about them, some cautionary, others oddly romantic, comparing love to a flea that bites two lovers and mingle their blood. Poverty amplified the shame. To scratch was to be seen was to be judged. Yet for the poor, who had no way to replace bedding or bathe regularly, this judgment was inescapable. The bugs were not just parasites. They were social markers, tiny emblems of a life lived without options. Still, people endured. They slept through the itch. They lit smoldering herbs and tied strings of garlic with hopeful hands. And each morning they rose, sometimes red-marked, often tired, but always ready to face another day. Because in a world where rest was never truly peaceful, persistence became its own form of grace. For knights and soldiers in the medieval world, sleep was not so much a retreat as it was a calculated risk. In peacetime, rest might come with the creak of a feather bed and the comfort of stone walls. But on campaign, under threat, or behind uncertain walls, sleep was a state you entered cautiously, if you dared to enter it at all. And sometimes you entered it in full or partial armor, because taking it off might cost you more than rest. Chainmail, though flexible, was never meant to cradle the body. It pinched, it pressed, and it held onto the cold like a second metallic skin. Yet during war, many soldiers, and even commanders, chose to sleep with it on, or at least with parts of it still strapped to their body. Helmets were often removed to avoid suffocation and offer some chance of relaxation, but breastplates, gambesons, or mail shirts often stayed on. To disarm completely was to bet that the night would remain peaceful, and in a world of sudden raids, ambushes, and surprise torches on the horizon, few were willing to wager sleep against survival. Weapons were never far. A sword might lie tucked beneath an arm, like an iron pillow. An axe leaned within arm's reach. Shields doubled as both a guard and a blanket, and the sound of someone shifting nearby in armor, the low, rusted rattle, was as common as snoring. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't gallant. It was vigilance at the cost of comfort. In castles under siege, men-at-arms sometimes slept in full kit, lined against walls or crowded in great halls, boots still on, breathing through sweat-soaked padding. Every creak became a possible threat, every footstep a signal. The few hours of rest they managed were shallow and tense, more like blinking than dreaming. Even those not in open combat faced similar routines. Traveling guards, mercenaries, or couriers moving through bandit territory might sleep with a dagger beneath their tunic. Some would sleep in seated positions, backs against trees or walls, boots planted firmly, ready to spring to their feet. Sleep became something scavenged in moments, not savored. A pause, not a refuge. For the elite warrior class, this wasn't a failing, it was a discipline. To sleep ready was to live ready. Comfort was seen as softness that dulled the edge. The best warriors, it was believed, could rest anywhere, on stone, in cold, beside fire, or in mud. If you needed softness, you hadn't trained hard enough. Yet the contrast was sharp. Back home, far from the field, Nobles reclined in elaborate beds with down-stuffed pillows and rich canopies. The same men who once curled up in wet armor beside drafty walls now rested in scented chambers, their swords stored rather than gripped. There, sleep was indulgent, a reward, not a necessity. But in the field, rest was a gamble. You closed your eyes because you had to, not because you felt safe. For the medieval warrior, the line between rest and readiness never fully blurred. You slept not when you wanted, but when the world allowed it. And even then, you slept with one hand still wrapped around steel.
When the boundary between sleep and waking blurred in the medieval night, it wasn't met with curiosity, it was met with dread. To rise in silence, eyes open but spirit absent, and to wander through halls or across fields without memory or purpose was not viewed as a harmless disorder. It was seen as a rupture, a crack through which something unknown and possibly unholy had slipped in. Sleepwalking was rare, but when it did occur, it left witnesses deeply unsettled. A child stepping barefoot through a churchyard at night. A woman found in the garden, murmuring in a tongue no one recognized. A man staring motionless at a wall, refusing to respond until shaken. These weren't seen as medical anomalies, they were signs, messages, warnings. The medieval world didn't separate mind and spirit the way we do today. To move unconsciously was to act without the soul's permission, and if the soul wasn't in charge, something else had to be. Demonic interference was a frequent explanation. The idea that a person could rise from bed and walk under the influence of invisible forces was terrifying, and to many it suggested possession, or at the very least, a spiritual attack. You weren't just dreaming, you were being used, your body commandeered, while your soul floated elsewhere. Families and neighbors reacted with alarm. Sleepwalkers were often woken not with gentle nudges, but with shouted prayers, shaken shoulders, or even slaps. Some were bound to their beds at night, wrists tied with cloth or tucked beneath wooden beams. In more extreme cases, crucifixes were placed under pillows or rosaries hung around the sleeper's neck, not to comfort them, but to keep whatever was stirring inside them at bay. In households where a member repeatedly wandered at night, stories began to form. Perhaps the person had sinned and was being punished. Perhaps a spirit had attached itself to them. Children who walked in their sleep were sometimes labeled touched, and girls especially risked accusations of impurity or hidden secrets. If the wanderer said they remembered nothing, it only deepened the suspicion. What else had they done? What words had they whispered, while their body moved on its own? Legends fed these fears. Folktales told of sleepwalkers lured into the woods by ghostly voices, never to return. Others spoke of those who climbed rooftops or stood at cliffs, driven by unseen hands. Some believed that if a sleepwalker crossed a stream, their soul could be permanently displaced. Others claimed that sudden awakening might trap the person forever in a state between life and death, not quite conscious, not quite lost. But behind these superstitions was a deeper anxiety, a terror not just of the night, but of the unconscious itself. In an age obsessed with control over the soul, moments when the body broke free were deeply disturbing. They hinted at a part of the self that couldn't be reasoned with, prayed over, or punished, a part that didn't follow rules. To sleepwalk was, in a way, to become unknowable. And in the medieval mind, that was perhaps the most dangerous thing of all, not demons or curses, but the quiet truth that inside each person was a depth no one, not even themselves, could fully understand. In the medieval night, silence was a myth. Sleep unfolded not in stillness, but in the persistent rustle of life, layered, uneven, often chaotic. There were no sealed windows, no insulation, no white noise machines whispering ocean sounds. Instead, people drifted into dreams accompanied by the clamor of animals shifting on the floor,
the lowing of cattle from the other side of a thin wall, or the rhythmic creak of wooden beams swelling in the damp. Sound wasn't a disturbance, it was the texture of existence. Church bells rang at intervals, dividing the hours of darkness as they did the day. In towns, the bell tower was both timekeeper and sentinel, announcing not only the canonical hours, but also warnings of fire, of invasion, of a body discovered in the street. A sudden peal in the middle of the night could yank everyone from sleep in an instant, but over time many grew so accustomed to their rhythm that the ringing blurred into the background like a heartbeat in the bones of the city. Outside the home, dogs barked at foxes, chickens stirred, cows groaned, and in damp weather thunder grumbled across the sky like some distant engine of judgment. Rain slapped thatch roofs, wind howled through chinks in the wall. In summer, drunken voices stumbled past windows in the dark. In winter, the fire crackled, until it didn't, and someone had to rise to stoke it, lest the cold creep in and settle over sleeping forms. Within the home, snoring was an orchestra. Entire families, parents, children, elders, travelers, shared beds or the same crowded room. Someone mumbled in their sleep. Another turned over, dragging the blanket with them. Infants whimpered. Someone coughed. A rat scurried across the rafters. A cat followed. A pot shifted on the hearth. And still, people slept. They didn't have the luxury of demanding silence. They adapted, letting their minds float just above the noise like a boat over turbulent water. They grew used to the patterns, the predictable rhythms of their companions and their surroundings. It was familiarity, not quiet, that soothed them. A fire's pop, a donkey's grunt, the snores of a sibling, these were the lullabies of the age. But beyond this adaptation, sleep also served as something deeper, a kind of escape. For those toiling through long days of labor, prayer, fear, or uncertainty, sleep became not just recovery, but release. It was the one part of the day not dictated by church, Lord, or weather. Dreams might be unsettling, but unconsciousness itself offered a rare freedom from hunger, from obligation, from the hard clarity of the waking world. Even in the noisiness of the night, rest was possible. Not because the world grew quiet, but because the sleeper learned to withdraw from it, to build an island inside themselves where the clanging bells and moaning wind couldn't quite reach. And so sleep became something more than a biological need. It became a form of silent resistance, a moment of stillness against the constant motion of a world that rarely stopped moving. As the centuries wore on and Europe slowly shuffled into the modern age, something strange began to happen. The fears that had once lived in the privacy of night, and the flicker of a dying fire, and the cold footstep heard when no one was awake, in the dream that clung like cobwebs, began to step fully into the light. What had once been whispered after prayers or muttered in sleep took on a louder, more dangerous form. Nightmares no longer ended with waking. They bled into the day. In places like Salem, that fear found a home. The community, isolated and bound tightly by belief, was already steeped in a culture where dreams, visions, and inner struggles were never considered entirely personal. A strange look, a bout of illness, an animal behaving oddly. These weren't just unfortunate events. They were signals, warnings, evidence. The invisible world didn't belong to the knights anymore. It had moved into the courtroom, into the pulpit, into the shared imagination of an anxious people. The language of dreams and demons that had once haunted medieval beds now returned in testimonies, in accusations, in frantic confessions. Girls claimed they saw spirits in their sleep, felt invisible hands pinching them, dreamed of black dogs and strange women whispering curses. These weren't dismissed as fantasies or internal struggles. They were accepted as real, as proof, as truth. Night terrors became legal arguments. Spiritual unrest became actionable suspicion. In a way, Salem was the inevitable results of a world that had spent centuries afraid of what moved in the dark.
What had once been the solitary domain of sleepers, fears of possession, of wandering souls, of whispered voices, had become collective, amplified. Where once a family might gather around a fire and pray for protection from the night, now an entire town gathered to protect itself from the people within it. And perhaps that was the most terrifying part, that fear no longer waited for the darkness. It dressed itself in daylight, wore the faces of neighbors, and walked into the meeting house with a Bible in one hand and suspicion in the other. The dreams had become real, not because they were true, but because enough people believed them to be. From the rustling straw of a medieval bed to the packed pews of a Puritan courtroom, the journey of fear was slow but steady. What began in the quiet hours as personal vulnerability, the dread of sleeping alone, the meaning of a strange dream, the feeling of being watched, turned outward. It became a mirror held up to society, and in Salem that mirror cracked. No longer was sleep the only place where demons crept. They walked now in daylight, fueled by sermons, sharpened by rumor, and carried forward by the very people who once feared the dark. It began quietly, as many storms do, not with thunder, but with a murmur. In the chill of early 1692, in the tightly wound town of Salem Village, 2 young girls began to act strangely. They screamed at nothing. Their limbs jerked without cause. They crawled under furniture, contorted their bodies, and shouted words no one understood. At first it was unsettling. Then it became unignorable. The girls, Betty Paris, daughter of the village minister, and her cousin Abigail Williams, were not just restless. They seemed gripped by something. They claimed to see invisible figures, cried out in terror, and barked like animals. They weren't alone for long. Other children began to exhibit the same behaviors, as if a current had jumped from one body to another. This was more than mischief or fever. It felt, to the Puritan mind, spiritual. Their parents, religious and already wary of the devil's reach, tried the usual remedies. They prayed, they fasted, they questioned. Nothing changed, so they turned to a local physician, William Griggs. His diagnosis, though it held no scientific basis, fit neatly into the beliefs of the time. He found no natural illness, therefore it must be unnatural. And with that, the door opened. What had once been contained to the home, strange fits and sleepless nights, now stepped into public discourse. If not disease, then what? If not affliction, then who? The logic was simple and deadly. If these girls were bewitched, someone had bewitched them. Then came the word, one word, whispered first, then shouted, then written down on official records. Witch. The moment it appeared, something irreversible took hold. A line had been crossed, not just a spiritual line, but a legal one. To speak the word witch in Puritan society was to invoke all the weight of scripture and fear, to ignite a process that could not be undone with silence. It gave shape to the invisible. It gave permission for suspicion. It made what was once inner fear into public accusation. The girls, now treated as victims of a spiritual crime, were asked who had hurt them, who had sent the specters, who had made their bodies contort and voices cry out. Whether through suggestion, pressure, or something deeper, they began to name names. The first accused were easy targets, outsiders, the poor, those who had always sat on the margins. But the seed had been planted. The girls' symptoms became a kind of theater of legitimacy. Each fit confirmed the guilt of the named. Each scream was a form of evidence.
What started as mysterious illness had now become something else entirely. A mechanism of hysteria. The line between reality and imagination vanished, and in its place grew a new kind of logic, one where pain proved guilt and fear needed no proof at all. As the strange fits of Salem's young girls drew crowds, a transformation occurred. What began as whispered confusion became a spectacle, and the girls, once helpless victims, now stood at the center of something far more powerful. Each scream, each gasp, each invisible attack they claimed to suffer became fuel for a growing blaze. They pointed, they collapsed, they accused. And in a society trained to see spiritual warfare in every shadow, their suffering was not questioned, it was believed. At first, their accusations landed on the expected: women who lived at the edges of town, widows, those who dressed oddly or spoke with too much boldness. Sarah Good, a homeless beggar. Sarah Osborne, who hadn't been to church in weeks. Tituba, an enslaved woman from the Caribbean whose difference was both visual and cultural. These women already lived under the weight of judgment. To call them witches only made visible the suspicion they carried every day. But then something shifted. The accusations didn't stop at the margins. They moved inward, toward the heart of the community. Girls cried out in courtrooms, clutching their throats, claiming specters of respected citizens were strangling them. Accomplished midwives, landowners, churchgoers, no one was off limits. Once the ritual began, fear outran reason, and the girls, many still children, held terrifying influence. To be named by one of them was to be trapped. Denial meant nothing if the afflicted screamed on cue. The public watched as neighbor turned against neighbor, and yet they didn't look away. The trials became theater. The courtroom, a stage. The girls performed fits that looked like divine punishment or possession, and judges leaned forward, listening with gravity. Every twist of a wrist, every sudden scream became another nail in someone's fate. What had started as spiritual panic quickly hardened into social weaponry. Old grudges resurfaced, land disputes found new fuel, a denied inheritance, a family feud, a whispered insult. Any of it could be reinterpreted through the lens of witchcraft. The word witch became a blade that cut cleanly through status, legacy, and even piety. Accusing someone wasn't just survival, it became a form of power. Soon, the fear that had once circled the village like smoke filled every household. If the respectable could be accused, then no one was safe. And in that realization, silence grew. People stopped defending the accused. To speak in someone's favor was to risk being next. And so, fear fed on itself, expanding into a loop of confession, accusation, and condemnation. What made it worse was that the system rewarded cooperation. Those who confessed to witchcraft often lived. Those who denied it, especially if they had nothing to offer in return, were hanged. The message was clear. Truth was negotiable, but survival required submission. And while the judges held the legal power and the ministers held the spiritual authority, it was the girls, their cries, their tears, their outstretched fingers, who steered the wheel. They were no longer afflicted, they were arbiters. They decided who stayed and who vanished, and the village, watching in fear, let them. Because when reason is drowned in panic, even children can rule the room. The courtroom in Salem was not a place of reason. It was a place where reality bent under the weight of imagination, where fear dressed itself in law and marched with authority.
Those summoned into its wooden walls did not face evidence in the modern sense. They faced emotions, public weeping, shouted curses, sudden collapses from the accusers. And through it all, a grim sense of ritual unfolded, more theater than justice, more hysteria than truth. Central to this chaos was a concept that would baffle any rational observer: spectral evidence. This was testimony based not on actions that could be seen or measured, but on what someone claimed to have seen in their mind, a spirit or specter in the shape of the accused, tormenting them in dreams or visions. The accused might be sitting silently in court, but if a girl screamed that their ghost was choking her, that alone was considered admissible proof. There were no limits. The invisible was treated as fact.
Without legal representation, the accused stood alone. Lawyers were not permitted. The logic was twisted. Since witchcraft was a crime against the community and against heaven itself, the court believed there was no need for a defense in the modern sense. Confession was expected. Denial was viewed as stubbornness, or proof that the devil was helping the accused conceal the truth. So the accused, often illiterate and unprepared, faced judges, ministers, and entire rooms full of hostile spectators with no one to speak on their behalf. And the accusations multiplied, encouraged by the attention, by the applause of judges, and sometimes by their own rising fear. More and more people came forward, not only to name others, but to name themselves. Self-accusation became a grotesque form of self-preservation. People confessed to things they never did, claimed they had flown through the air with witches, attended ghostly Sabbaths, signed pacts they never wrote, and in doing so, many were spared the rope. Those who confessed were useful. They could accuse others. This cycle fed on itself like a fire. The more who confessed, the more the court was convinced of a vast conspiracy. Entire families were swept up, not because of evidence, but because one member had been accused and the rest lived too close. Children testified against parents, wives against husbands. It was no longer about guilt, it was about proximity. Survival meant severing ties, even blood ones, and doing so loudly enough to be heard by the bench. The courtrooms, meant to be spaces of order, had become arenas of performance. Accusers would writhe on the floor, mimic the actions of the accused, fall into trembling trances. Judges didn't interrupt them, they leaned in. They took these fits as validation, as divine revelation. Rational objections dissolved. To doubt the afflicted was to doubt God. And so belief became mandatory. Even silence was suspicious. Mass suggestion took hold. The lines between what people truly believed, what they feared, and what they performed blurred into nothingness. Logic bowed out. In its place stood spectacle, dramatic, irrational, and fatally effective. Salem wasn't just a legal disaster. It was a surrender of the mind. A community hypnotized by its own reflection, punishing its fears, one accusation at a time. When the first ropes were tied and the first gallows raised, the hysteria of Salem passed the point from which it could never return. Accusations could be retracted, confessions could be recanted, but a hanging, that was final. And with the execution of Bridget Bishop in June of 1692, the trials crossed into irreversible ground. She was the first to die, but not the last. Her crime, like so many others, was silence in the face of madness. Bridget was loud, unafraid, and nonconforming. She wore clothes that drew attention, spoke with conviction, and had been in trouble before, not for witchcraft, but for living as she pleased. In a community that prized humility and suspicion, she stood out. And when the accusations came, Her refusal to crumble made her an easy target. She denied everything. She would not confess. And so, she was hanged. The executions weren't secret. They were public events, held on Gallows Hill where townspeople could gather and watch. There were no last-minute rescues, no moments of redemption. The condemned stood on wooden carts, ropes waiting above, while ministers urged them to repent. Some, facing the noose, held to their innocence until the end. Others, crushed by fear or isolation, wept, begged, or whispered prayers. But one thing was consistent. Those who refused to confess, who refused to lie to survive, died. This was the grim paradox of Salem. Telling the truth meant death. Denial was defiance, and silence, especially dignified silence, was read not as courage, but as guilt. In a court twisted by spiritual obsession, integrity became a capital crime. Among the victims were women and men, young and old. Sarah Good, poor and pregnant, walked to her death cursing her judges. Martha Corey, a deeply religious woman, was denounced by her own husband. John Proctor, a respected landowner, refused to falsely accuse others even when it might have spared him. Giles Corey, in an act of staggering defiance, was pressed to death with stones rather than speak a word, literally crushed by silence. These executions were framed as necessary purification. Ministers declared them just. Authorities prayed over the bodies. The townspeople, already exhausted by months of fear and chaos, watched not just with horror, but with a complex, collective relief, a kind of grim catharsis. The community, they told themselves, was being cleansed. The devil was being driven out. The hangings became symbolic acts, theatrical closures to a narrative no one dared question.
And yet, something began to shift. With each execution, the gap between accusation and justice grew harder to ignore. Some of the condemned were known to be deeply pious. Others had no known quarrels, no strange habits. The fits of the accusers began to look less convincing, the evidence thinner. But it was too late. The rope had already swung, and once it did, there was no untying what had been done. The gallows became not just instruments of death, but monuments to a tragedy unfolding in plain sight. Where once people feared witches in the dark, they now began to fear the judgments cast in daylight. And as more bodies were buried in unmarked graves, a new question crept in, quietly, unspoken, but rising. What if we were wrong? While Gallows claimed the headlines of Salem's hysteria, another quieter suffering unfolded behind the heavy doors of its jails. Dozens of accused men, women, and children, many never convicted, languished in cold, overcrowded cells. They waited in darkness, unsure if freedom, execution, or slow decay would come first. For some, the wait itself was a death sentence. The jails were not designed for long-term confinement. They were drafty, damp, and infested. Straw beds rotted quickly. There were no proper toilets, little food, and even less medical attention. Families, if they had the means and dared to be seen helping the accused, might send blankets or bread, but many prisoners were entirely dependent on the mercy of strangers or the goodwill of guards who themselves lived in fear of association. Children were not spared. Infants, born to imprisoned mothers, lived their first weeks among lice, filth, and prayers. Sarah Good gave birth in jail, only to see her newborn die before her own execution. Children, accused alongside adults, were shackled just the same. Some were too young to understand what they were charged with. One girl, Dorothy Good, just 4 years old, was locked away after being accused of witchcraft by those who claimed she bit them with her spirit. Her confused answers during questioning, frightened, contradictory, childlike, were taken as confession. The elderly suffered most brutally. They had the least chance of surviving the physical strain, the cold floors, the infections, the weight of chains meant to prevent flight from a prison none of them could escape anyway. Those too frail to stand through court proceedings were dragged in, questioned, and returned to their cells like broken furniture. Some died before a verdict was ever spoken.
Pregnant women faced a cruel paradox. Execution was delayed until they gave birth, but not out of mercy. It was law. A child was considered innocent, so mothers waited months at a time, with the knowledge that once their baby entered the world, they might be pulled from it. Some wept silently. Others clung fiercely to the life within them, as if carrying proof of worth. But the gallows had no patience for maternal grief. Still, even in that darkness, flickers of hope refused to go out. Letters were written, smuggled past guards, hidden beneath garments, carried by loyal family members. Ministers outside of Salem began to question the trials. Whispers of doubt circulated in Boston. Some local residents began to hesitate before repeating accusations, afraid they might be the next target. And within the prisons, prayer continued. Not all believed they would die. Some believed in justice, or at least in the survival of truth after their passing. A few prisoners were eventually released, especially after the trials began to lose credibility. But even those who walked free didn't emerge untouched. They left thinner, colder, quieter. Homes had been taken, children scattered, reputations ruined. They returned not to celebration, but to silence, survivors of something too tangled for words, too recent for mourning. Life in Salem's jails wasn't just defined by iron bars. It was shaped by waiting for names to be cleared, waiting for families to act, waiting for someone in power to say, enough. For some, that word never came. But even in chains, surrounded by fear, a handful held on to dignity, and in doing so preserved the final, fragile thread of humanity in a time that had nearly forgotten it. The witch trials in Salem reached their most perilous height when they began to devour not just the poor and voiceless, but the powerful. For months, the machinery of accusation had turned relentlessly, grinding through neighbors, farmers, ministers, and children. But when the girls, now emboldened by their unchecked influence, accused the wife of Governor William Phipps, the spell broke. Mary Phipps was a woman of standing, untouched by scandal, well-connected and deeply respected. Her name carried weight far beyond Salem Village, and unlike many of the previous accused, she had the protection of power. When her name was uttered, the implications were clear. If she could be named, anyone could. The hysteria had officially crossed the boundary between chaos and absurdity, and for the first time, those in charge felt personally vulnerable.
Governor Phipps, who had thus far allowed the special court of Oyer and Terminer to run unchecked, intervened. Whether driven by outrage, self-preservation, or sheer pragmatism, he recognized that the situation had spiraled beyond control. The very court he had authorized now threatened the social order, the colonial government, and the reputation of Massachusetts itself. In October 1692, Phipps officially dissolved the court. Trials continued in a more subdued form under a new structure, one that no longer accepted spectral evidence. Without invisible afflictions and dream visions to bolster their claims, many of the accusers' cases collapsed. Confessions dried up. Spectacles in the courtroom grew fewer. The spell was lifting. The public, too, began to feel the weight of what had been done. Over time, the sheer volume of executions and the nature of the people who had been condemned prompted a quiet reckoning. These were not strangers. They had been neighbors, godparents, fellow congregants. Some had been respected, devout, and even kind. And now they were gone.
by the hands of a justice system that had blurred into performance and paranoia. Even the judges who had once ruled with conviction began to doubt. Samuel Sewall, one of the most prominent figures in the trials, stood in church and publicly confessed his guilt. Ministers wrote sermons of caution and sorrow. Families who had once shouted accusations now lived with the burden of what those accusations had cost. It did not happen overnight. There was no formal declaration of error, no sweeping apology from the state, but the machinery stopped, the frenzy cooled, and Salem stood in the strange quiet of aftermath, not quite healed, not yet ashamed, but undeniably changed. The peak of the trials had been fueled by belief in evil. Their fall was fueled by the recognition of folly. Once fear had worn the mask of justice, now justice began, however tentatively, to reclaim its face.
In the years that followed the collapse of the Salem trials, the silence that had once protected hysteria was slowly replaced by something far heavier: reflection. As the gallows stood empty and the jail cells reopened, the village and the colony were left with the bitter weight of what had transpired. Lives had been lost not by accident or war, but by accusation, by ritual, by law. And now, with the smoke cleared, the question no longer whispered, but spoken aloud, was this: how could it have happened? The first voice to crack the surface of shame came from within the court itself. Judge Samuel Sewall, a pillar of authority during the trials, stood before his congregation in 1697 and did something few in his position had the courage to do. He publicly confessed. With trembling hands and a bowed head, he accepted responsibility for his role in the deaths and the ruin of innocent lives. He asked God and the community for forgiveness. It was not a theatrical performance, nor a political gesture. It was raw, humbling, and rare. Sewall wore a black sash each year on the anniversary of the executions for the rest of his life, a quiet mourning for what he had helped bring about. Others followed, more slowly. Jurors who had voted guilty began to speak of doubt. Witnesses who once screamed in court now admitted they had been mistaken, or misled, or terrified into saying what they thought the judges wanted to hear. Some accusers, now older perhaps, wiser, confessed that they didn't fully understand what they were doing, that they had been swept up, manipulated, or even enjoying the attention. It didn't undo what had happened, but it chipped away at the silence that had once masked it. Families of the condemned, once silenced by fear or shame, began to petition for justice. They wrote letters, collected signatures, demanded that the names of their loved ones be cleared. They argued that what had passed as justice was nothing more than sanctioned vengeance, carried out in robes and under the seal of court. And slowly, over decades, the government began to respond. In the early 1700s, partial reversals were granted. Some were symbolic, a name removed from a list, a record annotated. Others were more substantial, with financial compensation issued to families who had lost land, homes, or livelihoods because of the trials. It was not generosity. It was reparation, however delayed, and for those who survived imprisonment or watched their kin die, it was a faint acknowledgement that they had been wronged.
Yet even with apologies and revisions, the damage ran deep. The stain on Salem's name lingered and in many ways still does. Entire generations grew up knowing their relatives had been hanged, not for crimes, but for fear made flesh. The apologies could not resurrect the dead, nor could they erase the image of children pointing fingers, of good men staying silent, of ministers preaching paranoia. Still, the act of apology mattered. It said that collective madness could be admitted, that systems could fail, that belief, when weaponized, could destroy. And in the long shadow of Salem, this admission became a rare historical light, not just a lesson, but a mirror, one that every society, sooner or later, must dare to look into. Salem did not end when the gallows emptied or when the court fell silent. Its true legacy began after the last stone was laid over an unmarked grave. What happened there didn't simply fade into the past, it transformed into a symbol, one so potent that centuries later its name still evokes fear, injustice, and the fragility of truth. Salem became a mirror for every society that has ever struggled with the tension between fear and freedom, between law and hysteria, between order and morality. At its core, the trials exposed a truth as old as civilization. Fear is power. In Salem, it operated not with armies or chains, but with whispers and gestures. A single accusation, spoken by a child or neighbor, could dismantle a life. The state didn't have to prove harm, it only had to believe it. And in that belief, it found absolute authority. The more people feared being next, the more willing they were to look away, to conform, to participate. The fear of the devil may have been religious, but its mechanics were political. It disciplined the body and policed the soul. This lesson wasn't lost on those who came after. As the American colonies grew and matured, lawmakers remembered Salem. It became a cautionary tale, a scar etched into the framework of early American legal thinking. The Founding Fathers, many of whom studied the histories of Massachusetts and its failures, built protections into the Constitution to prevent another Salem. The right to legal representation, the right to confront accusers, the requirement of tangible evidence. These weren't theoretical principles, they were antidotes.
And still, Salem lingered. In the 20th century, during the Red Scare and McCarthy hearings, newspapers and politicians used the phrase, "a witch hunt," to describe the mass suspicion and career-ending accusations with little proof. The parallel was unmistakable. Just as in 1692, reputations were destroyed, families were torn apart, and public fear was channeled into performance. The ghosts of Salem had returned, not in cloaks and spells, but in subpoenas and televised trials. Writers, playwrights, and artists continued to explore its legacy. Arthur Miller's The Crucible did not merely dramatize the events, it held up Salem as a metaphor for every system that turns inward, devouring its own in the name of virtue. Salem came to represent the dangers of unexamined belief, the speed at which rumor becomes law, and the terrifying ease with which ordinary people can become instruments of extraordinary harm. But perhaps most important is how Salem shaped memory. The town, once a place of terror, eventually embraced its past not with pride, but with responsibility. Memorials were built. Names were remembered. Tourists still come, drawn by the eerie fascination of a place where fear once wore a human face. But the stones engraved with the names of the executed offer more than historical trivia. They offer a warning. Because Salem was never really about witches. It was about what people are willing to believe when they're afraid. About how easily justice can be rewritten by emotion. And how dangerous it is when we let belief go unquestioned. That is Salem's true inheritance. A whisper in the walls of every courtroom, a shadow behind every political purge, a name that asks again and again what we are capable of doing to each other when truth is no longer enough. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the world is suspended between dreaming and waking, something ancient stirs, not just in individuals, but in entire societies. The line between imagination and truth, fear and fact, spirit and body becomes fragile. And in that vulnerable space, both dreams and nightmares slip in. For the medieval world, that boundary was filled with demons, ghosts, whispers in the dark. For Salem, it became filled with voices in the daylight, accusations, and the thunder of verdicts falling like hammers. What changed was not the fear, only its shape. Throughout history, human beings have carried their private terrors into public life. What begins as a tremble in the night, a shadow at the foot of the bed, a dream that won't fade, can transform under pressure into law, into ritual, into punishment. The spectral fears of the sleeping mind become policies. The imagined threat becomes a real rope. The mind, left unchecked, projects its darkness outward.
In Salem, the fears once confined to solitary prayer, fear of witches, demons, temptation, judgment, burst through the collective psyche and took form. Children's fits, women's silence, dreams of black animals and invisible hands became the raw material for public action. People acted not on what they knew, but on what they felt. They punished not for what was proven, but for what was feared. This transformation, from dream to doctrine, from internal panic to external control, is not unique to Salem. It is a pattern, one that repeats itself in different costumes, different languages, different centuries. The dream of danger becomes the policy of protection. The suspicion whispered in the dark becomes the sentence read aloud. But history, in its strange mercy, leaves records. It leaves stories, names, mistakes carved into wood and stone. And from those echoes comes reflection. We begin to see the pattern, to recognize the rhythm. We see how tightly fear grips the human soul, how quickly it leaps from person to person, how easily it hides beneath robes, badges, pulpits, even love. We see how small beginnings, a dream, a superstition, a strange look, can end in crowds cheering beneath a gallows. Salem reminds us that the boundary between sleep and reality is not always about consciousness. It's about clarity, about how awake we truly are to our actions, our beliefs, our responsibilities. When fear sleeps within us, ignored, it does not die, it waits. And when awakened, it often finds the most efficient path is not through thought, but through others, whispered, repeated, institutionalized. That is why we remember. That is why the names of the condemned still echo, because they were not symbols, they were people, with hands, breath, families, laughter. Their lives were ended not by magic, but by the refusal to see clearly. And so their stories remain stitched into the fabric of history like a dream we cannot shake. In the end, the tale of Salem is not about witches or sleepwalkers, not about night terrors or courtrooms. It is about the thin, trembling thread between what we fear and what we do with that fear, between the image in the mind and the hand that reaches for the rope, between the dream and the waking world. It is a thread we still walk today,